This is a Dubai Eye 103.8 podcast. This is Afternoons with Helen Farmer.
It's all about living your best life.
On Dubai Eye 103.8.
Hi, I'm Helen Farmer. Fantastic to have you with us on the Afternoons with Helen Farmer podcast. We were looking at money matters on this show, speaking to Wilson Varghese of Zurich, Middle East, on getting your financial resolutions in order and hearing some of the best financial advice that you've been given over the years. It could be from an expert, it could be from your beloved family member. We absolutely loved the normal tips and tricks you've got for saving and spending. Shane Phillips of the Phillips Group was on hand with the opposite of a to-do list, a not to-do list, to help you land your dream job. From what to do or not to do in the interview process to your social media, some very practical advice on making sure you make it to the top. What about your education? Coursera is a completely different way of learning, hopefully making sure the next generation are out of debt. We were speaking to the CEO to find out exactly what it's all about. How does it work in practice and what courses are trending? And if getting more done is on your to-do list for 2022, maybe our guest Christina Bengston can help. She is an author. She is a motivational speaker whose TED Talk has amassed millions of views. And she's also a champion precision shooter, an expert on the art of focus. We are picking her brains to make sure we get stuff done without distractions. You're in the right place from expert advice.
Money Matters
On Afternoons with Helen Farmer.
with Zurich Life Insurance. Take optimistic action and shape your financial future with Zurich Life Insurance.
Dubai Eye 103.8.
We are looking ahead to 2022, which sounds a bit like 2022, the sequel, which I find quite optimistic, to be honest. I think we could all do with a bit of a redo. But when it comes to your finances, we're here to sort out your money issues, maybe helping you make some resolutions for the coming year. And joining us in studio is Wilson Varghese. He's the head of operations at Zurich Middle East. Wilson, thank you so much for being with us in the studio. Can I ask you, what kind of conversations you have growing up around money, and how do you think you've kind of been living your life in terms of financial advice? Anything that stayed with you along the way?
Yeah, first of all, thanks, Helen. It's
You're
a pleasure to be here. Growing up was, I'd say I'd had a very good grounding, at least as far as financial advice was concerned. Grew up in a middle-class family where, parents worked hard and saved for a rainy day pretty much all the time. In terms of conversations, there wasn't so much of a conversation. I'd say you'd do a lot of observing and you'd leave, the financial matters were left up to them. But I did learn a lot from how they live their daily lives. And a very interesting question you asked there around what's the best piece of advice you got. And I actually got that from home, from my aunt, who I remember my first job, spending every penny that I earned like there was no tomorrow.
I think we all did that.
Yeah,
it's pretty exciting when you first start making money.
Absolutely. It's such a thrill, right? It's dopamine effect, multiplied. But she told me, what are you doing about savings? And you ought to put some money away. If you don't see it, you won't spend it. And it doesn't matter how small. And that stuck with me. And actually, I've lived by that, and it's served me really well.
Well, lots of messages coming on exactly this. Patrick saying, if you can't afford two of it, you can't afford it at all. Jan says, my dad always told me to know the difference between a want and a need, and to never live beyond your need for wants. That's so true. In fact, my 6-year-old was learning about wants and needs at school recently, which was quite useful with Christmas coming up. So we've said, for Christmas, we've got a piece of paper, split it into four, and we said, okay, this is what you can do. You can have something you want, something you need, something to wear, something to read. So they were going, I need an iPad. No, you don't.
That's timeless advice.
You really don't. You want an iPad. You don't actually need anything. You lucky so-and-sos. But I think that want to need is actually a really interesting one. And even now, do I really need another pair of black boots? Not really. So let us know yours. Lots coming in. Now, I think financial resolutions can be actually quite tricky things to do, because at this time of year, obviously people are thinking about holidays, travel, presents. And then in our minds, we're like, January, I'm going to be a completely different person. Setting ourselves up for a bit of failure sometimes.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, financial resolutions are tricky. And it's different because we're all in different situations financially to start off with. And then separately, we also have different or changing financial goals. And so you don't have a broad brush approach that you can actually take to it, or one set of rules that applies to everybody. So they can be a bit difficult. But on the positive and the optimistic side, there are some common principles that you can actually apply, and that apply to every situation. And they're simple to say, and sometimes not so easy to execute on. But the key is to do something, no matter how small, and to do it consistently. And that's the key.
Taking action, I think, for me, was been one of the best resolutions I've ever made. And that wasn't necessarily financially. It was things like, if, a pair of shoes that I like needed to go to the cobbler, just take them. So to kind of stop the stewing is worse than the doing is the best advice I've ever got from my mum ever. And I think financially that can definitely be applied. We're going to be talking through your top tips this hour. Wilson, pay yourself first is number one. We're going to be talking about why that is so important and how to do it. Najib's been in touch on 4001 saying, every Saturday for 2 hours, I cook and I cook and I cook. I make sure and make enough food for my fiance and I to have lunch through the entire week. That's all it takes, 2 hours, about 200 dirhams in groceries.
Money Matters
On afternoons with Helen Farmer.
with Zurich Life Insurance. Take optimistic action and shape your financial future with Zurich Life Insurance.
Dubai Eye 103.8.
Joining us in the studio is Wilson Varghese. He's the head of operations at Zurich Middle East, and he's giving us some sound advice. And I want your top tips too. So if you consider yourself to be a savvy saver or spender, share your advice now. Your first tip for getting our head straight as we go into 2022 is pay yourself first. What do you mean by this, Wilson?
So, Helen, paying yourself first is really to set aside some money as soon as you receive your income or your salary. And that's right at the start. And managing with a budget thereafter. Chances are, if you don't do that first and you think, I'll just keep some aside just in case there's an unforeseen expense, guess what? There will be. So it's best to just let that money, out of your sight first. And that might be, depending on where you are, an emergency fund or a savings plan, whatever it might be. But you do that first. And there are financial as well as non-financial benefits to this. And typically what puts people off doing this also is that they think the amount would be very small. This won't make a difference, 500 dirhams, 1,000 dirhams, might as well spend it and enjoy it now. But what it does is goes a lot more than financial. What it does is helps you plan and make a budget. And live with that and learn, discretionary spends and needs and wants, just like you were mentioning earlier. And particularly if you've never done this before, it's very important, actually more important than the amount, is to actually start and do it consistently. And, sometimes I like to think of it as if you were, wanting to run the Dubai Marathon, you wouldn't, go out in your trainers the next day and try to do the whole 42K, would you? Depending on what physical shape you're in, you might start with a 2K or a 3K, do that consistently, and then as you get really good at it and confident, you build up from there. And paying yourself first, no matter how small, is exactly the same. I
think that's a really good analogy because I think it can feel quite intimidating, thinking I'm going to save 30% of my salary. Well, it's a big adjustment in terms of your day-to-day spendings and your mindset. So building up, and you believe in long-term investments in smaller amounts as well. Tell us more about that.
Yeah, absolutely. So the timeless adage, it's not about timing the market, it's about time in the market. And the fact, the miracle of compounding, as people put it, it's small amounts every month. And depending on, even if the market's moving up or down, you're still saving regularly and building up a retirement fund. Someone, I think back in the day, mentioned it in a very layperson's way, which is money makes money, and the money that money makes more money. So basically, that's the concept.
Wilson's with us this afternoon. Wilson Varghese from Zurich Middle East. I'm loving your advice that you're sending in on 4001 because this really is not about trying to bamboozle people. It's really to do with kind of living by your values and some really practical tips and tricks. So keep them coming in on 4001. Kaylee saying, check your statements. I just realised last month I'd been paying for a streaming service I hadn't used in 2 years. Honestly, that is me. That is absolutely me, Kaylee. Phil saying the best bit of money advice I ever got was to make more money, not save more money. Ask for more when starting for a new job. Push for a raise. Start a side business. I think that really comes back to what we were talking about earlier when, kind of knowing your value. Don't just accept that first offer. And no name on this one, but I love it. I recommend asking anyone offering advice how much money they have themselves. I don't take financial advice from anyone with less money than me. Love it. 4001. What's the best bit of financial advice you've ever received? Susan Zurich is here. She is the co-founder of Durham Stretcher, and here's what she's going to be doing in 2022.
COVID taught me one thing, it's to put aside more money. My main money resolution in 2022 is to always expect the unexpected, especially living as an expat. Hopefully we won't have to go through something like COVID again, but an emergency fund for the unexpected events, such as unforeseen unemployment or health issues, is very important. So definitely in 2022, I'll be increasing the amount of money I'm putting aside for a rainy day.
Susan there, co-founder of Durham Stretcher.
Money Matters
On afternoons with Helen Farmer.
with Zurich Life Insurance. Take optimistic action and shape your financial future with Zurich Life Insurance.
Dubai Eye 103.8.
New year, new money habits. This hour's all about you and your spending, sorting out your financial resolutions for the coming year. And joining us in the studio to help us out is Wilson Varghese. He's the head of operations at Zurich Middle East. Message here saying, read rule number 1 by Phil Town. It should be taught in schools. It's so simple to understand, so you've got confidence investing without paying over the odds financial advice that often suits the salesman commission, not your own financial future. Ex-father-in-law's recommendation is the best advice to come out of that marriage. It's still valid. We've got messages here we've got all sorts actually, loads coming in. Marty saying, I'm downsizing my car next year, just can't justify it, and while I miss it, I know it's a luxury. Sigh. There are a few things, Wilson, that we do really have to plan for. It could be schools, cars, obviously a big one, holidays, rent, absolutely number one for so many of us. Any insights there on how we can look at rent perhaps through different lens next year?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think obviously for most of us, rent's a big one, right? So, and sometimes with some challenges come opportunities. Mm-hmm. So, just generally being aware of what the value of property, your property or the properties around you are, is a good thing, because it gives you the opportunity to ask, am I paying over the odds for my rent, and a chance to negotiate a better renewal? Mm-hmm. Or if that's not forthcoming and you find there's actually better opportunities to move elsewhere for a similar lifestyle, but maybe even closer to work, closer to public transport, those are things that make quite a big difference if you can get them sorted. Separately, your situation, for example, might be that you're single and have you considered living with a good friend? I did that when I first started out because
Me too.
I loved being around people, and it was a good way to be social and at the same time has a massive impact on your savings.
Massive. I think whether we like to admit it or not, if we're planning to leave Dubai, we want to leave as winners. You want to leave having paid off a mortgage perhaps in your home country, or going back with a nest egg, or hopefully leaving debt free. And for so many people, the lifestyle can just really catch up with you. Marty saying now he knows his car's a luxury. And for some people, it might be rent, that I want to have this kind of house. But are you actually living within your means, and are you making those decisions for the right reasons? Talking earlier about some of what we're talking about is really some of the stuff that our parents lived by. It's old school values.
Absolutely. I mean, it's old school values. And whilst in the past we weren't bombarded, 16,000 times a day with different messages about,
you need this.
You
have to go there.
Yeah, and don't worry about affording it and things like that. That has kind of obscured some of it. But actually, it's just paring it back and going back to... And I'd argue the last 2 years are actually a great opportunity for us to look back, and a lot of us have actually done this. In fact, we were forced to by the pandemic. Some of our situations, have been...
I don't know, Wilson. I did a lot of online shopping during the pandemic.
Right.
But in terms of the going out aspect,
yes,
reassessing our life and our values, whether we did it consciously and sat down and journaled about it, or whether it was just conversations with our partner about, are we happy with our living situation? How do you feel about going back into the office? Commuting costs is another thing that people are saving a lot of money on as well.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, and all these things add up, right? SALIC, parking, fuel, depreciation on the car, insurance. So if you're able to actually make changes there, and the gentleman who's downsizing the car, my 2 thumbs up to him. those are absolutely the right things. And it's also about reevaluating. So when we return to normal, as we say, do we need everything back that we had cut out from our lives? Or is there some of it that actually we were quite happy with not having, and continue and use that towards your nest egg?
One of your bits of advice is about the air conditioning. And this one goes out to my husband, who I think is part polar bear. What do you think is the optimum temperature to save us a few dirhams on our energy bill?
24 degrees.
Oh, music to my ears. It's 19 degrees in the studio. That's wearing Christmas jumper. But yeah, reduce your bills there. Buying local, recycling. There are some, as you're saying, kind of going back to some of the values that our parents might have been, make, do and mend. But I think what you were saying earlier about kind of being bombarded is so true. We literally carry computers in our pockets with, people, companies whose life mission and, life's work is to make us part with our cash. And it takes an awful lot of willpower to not bow into that. I'm not saying don't treat yourself. Of course, treat yourself. Enjoy. You can't take it with you when you're gone and all of that stuff. But there's a balance to be struck between overindulging, especially when it comes to kids.
Yeah,
I think that's
absolutely.
a big factor here.
Absolutely. I mean, you've hit upon it, right? Balance is the key word here.
I think with Christmas coming as well. Needs and wants, children, needs and wants. You mentioned before about analysing your needs. When it comes to getting advice, it can be really difficult to have honest conversations with a partner, or sometimes a husband or a wife will kind of tend to dominate the knowledge and make those decisions. Where do you feel like you can start to have some of those conversations to make sure that everyone is aware of what the family's financial situation is, should the worst happen?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that's a great question here. And obviously, it really helps when, partners are on the same wavelength. But the positive thing is that even if you might be on a different wavelength in terms of their outlook, your goals are still common and your goals are still aligned. And I think focusing on what's the goal that we're saving for and what's the optimum way for us to reach there is probably the place to start. And sometimes, we may think that we know it all, but it's always better to get other perspectives as well. Do your research. These are some of the things. And I mean, today, it's so easy to get, there's a lot of advice. So you have to be a bit discerning when you go online. But you've got a financial advisor you could call upon. You could call a trusted friend, or you have, articles available online. So there's plenty of resources. But I think what's the most important thing is having the conversation. That's the most important thing.
Our conversation came when my husband and I were going away for a wedding, and I had what can only be described as a breakdown the night before, in tears, going, what if we get hit by a black cab? And, what would happen? And I don't know this. So we created the very gloomy named death drawer, which has got a piece of paper in it, which has got all the policy numbers and the passwords and an envelope to be opened by one of the girls' godmothers. And no one likes having these kind of conversations. No one relishes thinking about the worst happening. But my goodness, should it happen and you're trying to pick through paperwork while in the midst of grief, you will be so grateful to be in control of that knowledge.
Yeah, absolutely, Helen. I mean, I think you've hit upon such an important aspect out there. And hence why my earlier point about having the conversation is really important, but also a place where you're aware of the situation, the policies you might have, the bank accounts you have, the will, all of that stuff, should the unthinkable happen. And if anything, the last 2 years should point towards enough evidence of stuff can happen. Absolutely.
And that can be life insurance. It can also be, critical insurance cover, because we don't know. We're still in the midst of a pandemic, and, that's something we all need to be super aware of. And it could be cancer, it could be other terminal illnesses. But to have that reassurance. I turn 40 next year. I think it's finally time for me to grow up as a mother of two, and start doing the things that I've kind of been putting off. And it's kind of looking after your future self, I suppose. We don't like to think about ourselves being that much older, or being vulnerable, or being unwell. But there is so much comfort in knowing that you'll be taken care of.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's really important. The earlier you start, the better. I mean, the best time was 10 years ago. The next best time is right now. So I think that's really important. And we're talking about life insurance, right? We talk about paying ourselves first, etc. But what life insurance does, it helps you protect 100% of what you make today. And that's significantly more powerful and impactful for your families. And it's really important to ensure that your family has that protection during your working life, because that's when it affects them most, because they're ongoing expenses. So things like, if you don't have it, you definitely ought to get it. If you have some, review your situation. You may need more, you may need less. Kids may have grown up, and so I think it's never going to give you the dopamine effect that biting into a nice juicy steak will do, but it's one that will last.
Black boots. Wilson's with us. Wilson Varghese is the head of operations at Zurich Middle East.
Money Matters
On afternoons with Helen Farmer.
with Zurich Life Insurance. Take optimistic action and shape your financial future with Zurich Life Insurance.
Dubai Eye 103.8.
We are talking financial resolutions. Some great advice coming in from you on 4001 and from our guest in the studio too. Wilson Varghese is the head of operations at Zurich Middle East. And it's not, a case of looking at your bank account receipts, making Excel spreadsheet, but sometimes you need to sort out the emotional issues before you can sort out the money issues, and we're helping you start anew in 2022. I love this from Rishi saying, I live by Warren Buffett. On earning, never depend on a single income, make investments to create a second source. If you buy things you do not need, you'll have to sell things you need. Do not save what is left after spending, but spend what is left after saving. Wilson, you're nodding along, going exactly to your very first point there about pay yourself first. And lots of people getting in touch. One saying, best advice from my dad. Credit card is for convenience and not for me. Save your pennies. The pounds take care of themselves. Exactly echoing what you're saying about these little small adjustments and investments can really make a difference, often without us even realising it. But when we're talking about money, it's not necessarily just about dirhams hitting your bank account. Sometimes it's about health, quality of life, the way you live your life. How would you kind of expand on that as we look at 2022 as a whole, Wilson?
Yeah, I think it goes without saying that, your financial, what you save helps you financially for your retirement and your nest egg. But there are certain actions that you take that actually help you in many other ways as well. You've touched upon them, health, well-being. So, for example, we spoke earlier about potentially living near public transport. I bet you chances are that if you are taking a car or whether you live close to public transport, you'll probably be doing more steps if you take public transport than if you take your car. So simple things like that. I'd say is, for example, in terms of being a conscious spender as well, online shopping, you mentioned that earlier, is so convenient. But for example...
Too convenient.
Too convenient. But for me, what I do is I consciously, for example, try to make one trip to the grocer where I have to physically go there. And I know it takes me 1,600 steps. That's just going and coming. Not to mention the time I'll mill about there.
And then carrying stuff back.
And so that's a bit of weight's done. And it's lighter on my wallet. It's lighter for me. And so there's physical well-being and so many other benefits that come from it.
I think controlling your environment is really key. And yeah, to come back to the online shopping. This is something I'm definitely going to do, is just kind of disable my credit card from any of my normal go-to sites. Yeah, if I've got to get up the sofa and go and get my handbag, then there's going to be a delay that might just stop me pressing buy.
Yeah, absolutely. And speaking of credit cards, I'd say, one piece of advice that stood me really well is pay it off in full every month. And that's really key, because you'll be paying odds on, a lot more if you are revolving.
Comes back to that compound interest. Yeah, it really does, good or bad. Thank you so much for your advice this afternoon and for being so honest about what you've learned over the years, both personally and professionally. And thank you to everyone who's been in touch as well on 4001. Cannot thank you enough. It's zurich.ae for some more information as well. If you are looking to, put your big girl or boy pants on and get yourself sorted for 2022.
Life Balance on Afternoons with Helen Farmer.